We all know Netflix is massive. They were the OG streaming service that destroyed Blockbuster and gave cable TV providers a run for their money. But did you know that Netflix was not only a strong performing stock, but the best performing stock in the S&P 500 for an entire decade?
They certainly didn't anticipate a global international launch, all at once in 2013. Those are the things that drove the stock higher.
If you invested money in Netflix at the start of 2010, you would have nearly 100x your money at the peak. For perspective, with Amazon, you would have roughly 33x your money, and with Apple, you would have roughly 25x your money. Considering this stellar performance, Netflix is often grouped with the top tech companies in the world, even though it's only a fraction of the size. Once the pandemic hit, Netflix stock just skyrocketed even more as people binge shows and movies on Netflix as they didn't know what else to do. But over the past couple of months, Netflix hasn't been doing so hot. In fact, Netflix is down over 50% within just the last 4 months, which correlates to a $150 billion loss in market cap. This makes Netflix the 5th worst performer in the S&P 500. So here's how Netflix went from being the #1 stock in the S&P 500 for a decade to being part of the bottom 1% all within a matter of months. One of Netflix's most deep-rooted problems is that they're dependent on the traditional TV and movie industries for content. In other words, Netflix's ability to have a large and diverse library of content is extremely dependent on how many licensing deals they're able to make with production studios. Now, Netflix has been well aware of this since the very beginning, and that's why one of their biggest focuses has been producing Netflix originals. Over the past decade, they have pumped out several phenomenal series like BoJack Horseman, House of Cards, and of course, Squid Game. Aside from these originals, they've also bought tremendous shows like Money Heist and Lucifer. But at the end of the day, Netflix's original content and strategic purchases only account for a fraction of their entire library. This means that if production studios were to boycott Netflix for one reason or another, Netflix would lose most of its content and probably a significant portion of their subscribers. From the very beginning, many studios have refused to license their content to Netflix. And with time, the proportion of studios that refuse to work with Netflix has only increased due to the rise of competitors. By far the biggest competitor against Netflix is of course Disney+. Disney didn't even launch their streaming service till November of 2019 or just over 2 years ago. But despite their recent entrance into the market, they already have nearly 130 million subscribers. For perspective, Netflix currently has 221 million subscribers, so Netflix does still have about 90 million more subscribers. But if Disney was able to make up half the ground within 2 years, imagine where they'll be within 5 or 10 years. It looks to me like it's just a matter of time until Disney Plus surpasses Netflix in subscribers. And the key reason for this is that Disney is a full-on production company. First, they have Walt Disney Production Studios with all the classics including Aladdin, Alice in Wonderland, Frozen, and Moana. Then, they have Pixar, which includes Soul, Coco, The Incredibles, Cars, Finding Nemo, Inside Out, Toy Story, and basically every other animated movie that we grew up with. And then, they have Marvel, which includes the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe from Iron Man to Endgame. The only thing they're missing is a few Spider-Man movies. And then, they also have the entire Star Wars universe, and we can't forget about The Mandalorian. And then, they also have a large library from National Geographic. And then, on top of all of that, they have a few oddball movies too, like Avatar. Disney owns the full rights to almost everything we covered. With that being said, Disney isn't dependent on licensing from anyone because they already own everything. In other words, Disney is a production company that launched a streaming service, while Netflix is a streaming service that does some production. And as more production companies launch their own streaming services like Paramount+, it's just going to become harder and harder for Netflix to retain content and subscribers. Moving on to Netflix's second biggest issue, we have the pandemic. Now, this might be a bit confusing as the pandemic was originally hailed as a golden ticket for stay-at-home businesses like Netflix. But long-term, I think the pandemic was actually negative for Netflix for 2 reasons, with the first being consumers' openness to try other streaming services. Here's the thing, most people who were into streaming shows and movies already had a Netflix subscription before the pandemic started. What they didn't have was a Disney Plus or a Paramount Plus or a Hulu subscription. And the main reason for this was that they didn't want to pay for more than one streaming service on a regular basis. When they were stuck at home though, it made a lot more sense to pick up a few more subscriptions. Now, to be honest, most of these guys have likely gotten spoiled with having all these subscriptions, and they won't be canceling any of them anytime soon, and this includes me as well. But for people who actually have a social life and do things other than just watching YouTube and movies, it may not make sense to pay for all these streaming services, and they may cut back down to just one. This brings up the question of which subscriptions will they cancel. But really, this doesn't even matter because the net gain will always be in favor of the competition. For example, Disney Plus has gained 100 million subscribers since the start of the pandemic, while Netflix has gained 40 million subscribers. Now, let's say 10 million subscribers who have both subscriptions decide to cut down to just one. Even if all of them choose to stay with Netflix, Disney Plus had a net gain of 90 million subscribers, which is over 2 times Netflix. Also, realistically, the split will likely be closer to 50-50 and might even lean in Disney's favor. Moving on to the second reason that the pandemic was bad for Netflix in the long run, we have the seriousness of the competition. Before the pandemic, the streaming business was simply an addition to many production companies' businesses. But during the pandemic, streaming became one of their top priorities. Take Disney for example. Before the pandemic, they were consistently launching movies that pulled in over $1 billion at the box office, and they had theme parks all around the world. But when their revenue from theatrical releases and theme parks go to zero overnight, where do you think they're going to shift their focus? The answer is obvious: streaming. Many big box films like Soul completely skipped the theaters and launched directly onto streaming services. And it's not just Disney either. This scenario is applicable to all production studios. All of them had much more to gain from the pandemic, and they all started taking streaming much more seriously. So the pandemic was actually relatively harmful for Netflix. Even if the pandemic didn't happen and Netflix didn't have a dependency issue, they still have a massive hurdle to cross, which is sustained growth. Here's the thing, Netflix has basically put all their eggs into the basket of video streaming. And this makes sense because they need to focus on maintaining market share against production studios. But let's say they do it. Instead of losing to Disney Plus, let's say Disney and Netflix become a duopoly within the streaming industry. What happens next? Well, the answer is market saturation. Sooner or later, everyone who wants a streaming subscription will already have a Netflix subscription. You could argue that Netflix has already reached this point given that they missed subscriber growth targets and are forecasting weak growth moving forward themselves. But even if you don't think Netflix has reached market saturation quite yet, how much more could they really grow? 300, 400, 500 million subscribers? Even if they're able to grow to 500 million subscribers, that's only a little more than a 2x from where they are today. Now, this isn't a bad thing. As companies mature, they obviously can't put up the same growth numbers. But with that being said, these companies should also no longer be valued as growth companies. For much of Netflix's history, their PE ratio has hovered well above 100. And even with the recent decline, they've maintained a PE ratio over 30. So maybe the recent decline is just the market adjusting to the fact that Netflix is no longer the insane growth company that it once used to be. Every maturing company faces this same issue sooner or later. Some of them learn to diversify and grow through alternate streams of revenue, while other companies just stagnate for a while at the top before they start declining as more innovative companies take over the market. Apple, for example, faced the same issue in the mid-2010s. iPhone sales were not only stagnating but declining. At first, Apple tried to combat this by raising prices on their iPhones to increase profit margins, and that's kind of what Netflix is doing right now. But the thing to note is that even Apple realized that there was a limit to how much they could raise prices, and they would actually lower their launch price with the iPhone 11. So Netflix can't just keep raising prices to substitute for growth. For Apple, the answer to slowing growth was focusing on services like Apple Music, Apple Care, iCloud, Apple TV, and so on and so forth. In other words, the key was to offer more value to existing customers as opposed to trying to gain new customers. Netflix is trying to do this as well with services like Netflix Games, but the problem with such endeavors is that they're usually hit or miss. Sometimes a new service is exactly what customers were looking for, other times not so much. So the market doesn't want to give Netflix too much credit until it's proven that they have a future in something other than just video streaming, which they've nearly saturated. Looking forward, it's not like Netflix is going anywhere anytime soon. We can't say that Netflix is too big to fail given that we've seen far larger empires getting wiped out time and time again. But given Netflix's size, this is definitely not something that would happen overnight. If Netflix were to fail, it would probably be similar to something like Dish Network. It would start with a decade of stagnation, followed by a decade of subscriber losses to the competition, followed by the decade in which Netflix would actually collapse. So Netflix has at least 2 decades to figure something out here, whether that's expanding their services into gaming and live streaming, or whether that's becoming a full-on production studio themselves. Given how much time Netflix has, you would think that they're safe. But then again, you could have said the same thing about Dish 10 or 15 years ago. Now personally, I think Netflix is a much more innovative company than Dish. After all, Netflix is more of a tech company than a media company. So I'm sure they'll come up with some creative solutions, especially with Reed Hastings at the helm. But only time will tell. Who do you guys think will win the streaming wars? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're thankful that Netflix pioneered streaming. And of course, consider checking out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.